I'm Tim Holhouse, and I am one of the brewers here at Old Dominion Brewing Company. I also am in charge of quality assurance and quality control, and I'm just going to walk you through the brewing process.
Cool.
So basically the whole process starts here when we pull base malt, usually either pale or pilsner malt, from one of these two grain silos. So we get bulk deliveries every few weeks to fill up these silos. The process begins, a batch of beer basically begins when we decide how much bulk malt, how much pale malt or pilsner malt we want in each batch. So here we're doing 25 barrel batches, and I would say our base malt usually runs between 1,000 and 1,200 pounds. So we basically just type in 1,200 pounds on this little panel, and we call for the pale malt from the outside, which comes in through an auger and into this hopper up here. Any specialty malts that are added during the brewing process get added by hand. One of the brewers basically takes the forklift, grabs specialty malt off the shelf. For example, we have a little rye malt here. We've got some Munich, and we then hoist those up onto the platform with the forklift and cut the bags open by hand, put them on top of the bulk malt. After the entire malt bill is in this hopper, we start the milling process up. So basically, 12 to 1,400 pounds of malt gets lightly crushed as it goes through this mill, and then this auger takes it over above the mash kettle. So when we start the milling process up, again I said the grain is lightly crushed basically to allow our water to get to the endosperm of the grain and allow enzymatic conversion inside each of the kernels. So as I said before, the grain is shuttled over here into another hopper where the crushed grain, now called grist, sits. When we're ready to mash in, mashing is the process where the grist or crushed grain is combined with water at a certain temperature to basically produce sugar water. And so we'll basically fill this mash kettle up with around 500 gallons of water. We'll add any salts that we'll want for this brew, and then we'll basically allow the grist to fall into the mash kettle as the mash is agitated. Turn the agitator on here. And then we basically have the water heated to the appropriate temperature to allow for the appropriate conversion and the appropriate mouthfeel that we want in the beer. After the mash is complete, which takes about a half an hour for conversion, the mash is then heated up to stop the enzymatic conversion, and it's pumped over into the lauter tun. So this is the lauter tun, and so basically what you see here is the mash, which is sort of like a porridge. So it's basically grain and sugar water. So the idea here is to, in the brewing process, is to produce sugar water, which then the yeast metabolize under anaerobic conditions to then produce ethanol, which gives us the alcohol in our beer. So at the bottom of this vessel is a screen, and so the mash sits on top of the screen, and the spent grain gets left behind, and we pull the sugar water through this screen, eventually compacting the grain bed, which also acts as a filter itself, and then this is run off into the brew kettle where the boiling occurs. This here is the brew kettle. It's heated by steam jacketed. There's nothing fancy about this piece of equipment, but basically we then take our sugar water, which we've gotten from our lauter tun, is pumped over into the brew kettle. That's filled. We normally have about 900 gallons in there. We boil that for approximately an hour and a half. We add hops at different times, either for bitterness, for flavor, or for aroma. And then after 90 minutes, we stop the boil. And at that point, we then transfer the contents of the brew kettle over into this vessel, which is called a whirlpool. And right now we're doing the transfer, so essentially what's happening is the contents of the brew kettle are being forced through this pipe at a very high speed so that it causes a whirlpool action. And at the end of this transfer, what we have is a lot of protein and that is now precipitated out and remains on the bottom of the whirlpool, as well as like any of the plant material from the hops. Once this is all settled out, the contents of the whirlpool now get pulled from the side to leave as much junk behind as possible, and that is transferred to the fermenter. But at this point, the contents are still around 200 degrees Fahrenheit, so we run it through this box, which is known as a heat exchanger. So we're pumping cold water in one direction and hot wort, which is unfermented beer, in the opposite direction. And basically, they're separated by a series of plates, and the cold water becomes hot water, and the hot wort becomes cold wort, and that then goes into one of the fermenting vessels. And we'll walk and we'll take a look. And during the process is where the only time where we add oxygen, we aerate the wort so that the yeast have a little bit of oxygen to get them ready for cell division. So these are our fermenting vessels. These in this aisle hold 50 barrels. So essentially we have to brew twice on our 25-barrel brew house in order to fill one of these fermentation vessels. Now before we send the first batch into each of these fermenters, we've already prepared the fermenter by putting the appropriate amount of yeast in the fermenter, so the fermentation can begin within a few hours of collecting our first batch of beer. As we walk further towards the back here, you'll see that the tanks get larger. We have an area of 100 barrel tanks. So the tanks we have to brew 4 batches to fill. And then even larger, we have 200 barrel tanks. So essentially we would have to brew 8 times in order to fill one of these tanks. But most often these tanks are used for dry hopping and oaking processes. So a number of batches from the smaller tanks are transferred into these tanks for dry hopping. So fermentation takes about 3 days here in the case of our ales, and around 5 days in the case of a lager. After that, when basically the most active stages of fermentation are done, there's a period of conditioning. So it can be from several weeks for our ales and often a couple months for our lagers.